The sun hung low over the small town, casting a golden hue over the cobblestone streets. The people whispered in hushed tones, their conversations thick with the weight of history that was marked by a bitter rivalry between two families, the Silvas and the Costas. This was not just any feud. No, this one had been passed down through generations, like an heirloom too precious to discard. The hatred was woven into their very identities, and it ran deeper than most could comprehend. To be a Silva meant despising a Costa. To be a Costa was to loathe a Silva. It was an unspoken rule, a law that could not be broken. In the heart of the Silva family stood Clara, a woman whose spirit was forged in the fires of that ancient hatred. Her father had taught her well, taught her to hold her head high and never forget who the true enemies were. The Costas had wronged them in ways too many to count, and for Clara, the idea of forgiveness was as foreign as peace itself. She was a woman of strength, determination, and a resolve hardened by the legacy of her family. But beneath that iron will, a small part of her had always wondered, was it possible to live without this hate? Or was it the only thing keeping her anchored to the world she knew? Across town, on the other side of the divide, stood Lucas Costa. Unlike Clara, Lucas had grown up hearing the stories of the feud, but he never truly understood them. His family's animosity with the Silvas was a distant shadow, something he'd inherited but never truly experienced. To him, the Silvas were nothing more than a name, a part of history he'd been taught to fear and mistrust. But his world was one of idealism, a world where things could change, where the past didn't have to define the present. He was the son of a family that prized grace over grudges, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this inherited feud was both unjust and unnecessary. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the town's atmosphere grew thicker with tension. Clara and Lucas were living in parallel worlds, their lives separated by the chasm of a feud neither of them had chosen. Clara's days were filled with chores, meetings, and the occasional family gathering where the Costas were always the topic of conversation. The hate that ran through her veins was undeniable, yet there were moments, brief moments, when she questioned if this was all there was. Could there ever be a world where she wasn't bound by the shadows of this family war? She didn't dare voice such thoughts aloud. Not in a world where loyalty to the Silva name meant everything. But Lucas, he was different. His life was governed by dreams of breaking free from the constraints of the past. He wasn't content with merely maintaining the status quo, with continuing a legacy of hate for the sake of tradition. As he grew older, he began to question the validity of the stories he'd been told. His family had ingrained in him the necessity of never associating with the Silvas. But was it really so simple? Wasn't it time to question the narratives that had shaped their lives for so long? Yet, despite his growing rebellion against the old ways, there was a hesitation deep within him, a hesitation born of the same fear that gripped his father's heart. What would happen if he defied his own blood? What could he truly accomplish if he took that first step into the unknown? It was in the midst of this uncertainty, where tradition and desire collided, that the town began to feel the weight of the rivalry's unshakable grip. The townspeople spoke in quiet whispers, exchanging knowing glances as they observed the Cold War that stretched between the Silvas and the Costas. It wasn't just about business or power anymore. It was about pride. A pride that had been nurtured for generations. And in the midst of it all, Clara and Lucas were unknowingly about to become the key players in a story that would challenge everything they had been taught. As the evening air grew cooler, Clara stood by the window, gazing out at the silhouette of the Costa estate in the distance. It was a familiar sight, one that always stirred something deep within her. A part of her had always yearned to understand the people on the other side of this war, to know what drove them, to see beyond the animosity. But that part was quickly silenced by the voices of her family, by her father's unwavering conviction that the Costas were enemies to their very core. She had learned to bury her doubts, to suppress the small flickers of curiosity that sometimes crept into her heart. The legacy of the Silva family was one of strength, one of never backing down, and Clara had every intention of upholding it. But as Clara turned away from the window, her eyes met the familiar gaze of her mother, who was sitting in the living room, knitting quietly. There was no need for words. The bond between them was unspoken, yet deep and resolute. Her mother's eyes held a silent understanding, a shared commitment to family honor. Clara's thoughts flickered back to her brother's mischievous grin, to the family dinners where their father's voice echoed with stories of triumphs over the Costas. Yet, despite all the fire and passion, a quiet sadness tugged at Clara's heart. Was this what she was destined for? A life of inherited rage and endless grudges? Meanwhile, Lucas found himself in his father's study, staring at the family crest, a symbol of centuries of wealth, power, and untold conflict. The pressure to uphold his family's name was heavy on his shoulders, but Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to life than playing his part in a war he didn't understand. He wanted to write his own story, to step out of the shadow of a past he hadn't created. But how could he escape a history that was written in every corner of his world? How could he confront the unspoken rule that his family had enforced for generations without causing irreparable harm? In those quiet moments of introspection, he longed for a different path, a path that might one day lead him to someone who could understand him, a path that would lead him far away from the Costa Silva legacy. The annual festival was in full swing when Clara first laid eyes on Lucas. It was a celebration that brought the whole town together, the air alive with music and the scent of fresh pastries wafting from the food stalls. People danced in the streets, and the clinking of glasses could be heard echoing around the square. Clara was there with her family, of course, standing on the periphery, watching the festivities unfold with a sense of detached curiosity. As she scanned the crowd, her gaze suddenly locked onto a figure across the square, a man with a relaxed posture and an effortless charm that seemed to draw everyone's attention. It was Lucas Costa. For a split second, time seemed to slow. Clara's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't explain it. There was something magnetic about him. He wasn't like the others. While the rest of the townspeople played their roles, continuing the cycle of unspoken tension, Lucas stood apart, seemingly unaffected by the years of history that weighed down on their families. His eyes met hers briefly, and in that fleeting moment, there was no animosity, no legacy of hate, just a quiet understanding, as though they were both aware of the unspoken barrier that divided them, but neither of them spoke. It was as if the moment was too sacred to disrupt, and neither of them wanted to risk crossing the line. Clara quickly turned away, her heart racing. She had been taught to avoid the Costas at all costs, to never let her guard down, and yet, something in her stirred, something unfamiliar. She had always prided herself on her unwavering loyalty to her family, but this was different. This was curiosity. The pull was undeniable, but she refused to give in. She couldn't. Not here, not in front of the others, and definitely not in the middle of a town that thrived on this rivalry. But Lucas, oblivious to the weight of her thoughts, continued to move through the crowd, his presence like a beacon in the sea of faces. Over the next few weeks, Clara couldn't shake the memory of that brief electric moment. She tried to ignore it, throwing herself into her daily duties and family obligations. But no matter how hard she tried, thoughts of Lucas kept resurfacing, like an itch she couldn't scratch. She caught herself wondering about him, what drove him, what he truly believed in, and why he was so different from the rest of his family. These thoughts were dangerous, she knew. The very foundation of her life was built on the belief that the Costas were her enemies. They had wronged her family for too long. One afternoon, fate intervened. Clara was running errands in the town square when she found herself face to face with Lucas once again. This time, there was no crowd to shield them, no distractions. They stood there for a long moment, the space between them thick with unspoken words. Neither of them moved, neither of them spoke. But something had shifted. There was no longer any pretending, no more walls to hide behind. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Clara saw the vulnerability in Lucas's gaze. He wasn't just the son of a rival family. He was a man, just like her, caught in a war he didn't choose. "Clara," Lucas said, his voice steady but soft, as though he were testing the waters. "I never wanted this. The hatred, the rivalry. It's not who I am." Clara felt a lump form in her throat. The words she'd rehearsed for so many years now trapped inside her. She wanted to respond, to remind him of the years of bitterness that had shaped both their families, but something stopped her. Was this what it meant to live without hatred? Was it possible to build something new? Something untouched by the past? Before she could answer, Lucas stepped back, sensing her internal struggle. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I shouldn't have said anything." But Clara wasn't sure anymore. She wasn't sure if his words were a mistake or if they were the start of something she had never expected, something that could change everything. Clara walked away from that moment with a head full of questions and a heart that seemed to be pulling her in two directions. She couldn't deny the connection she felt with Lucas, the subtle attraction that had been building ever since that first encounter. But she also couldn't ignore the voice in her head, the voice that reminded her of her duty to her family, to her name, to everything she had been taught to uphold. The weight of that history was suffocating, and yet there was a strange sense of liberation in the thought that maybe, just maybe, she could choose her own path. Over the next few days, their paths crossed again, once by chance, and once more by design. Their meetings were brief but charged with an undeniable energy. They would talk in hushed voices, stealing moments of solitude whenever they could, as if the world around them didn't exist. Clara found herself opening up in ways she never had before. She told him about her dreams, about the life she imagined for herself if the world weren't so bound by the chains of family legacy. Lucas, in return, shared his frustrations, how he longed to escape his family's shadow, to not be defined by the hatred that had been passed down through generations. But with each meeting, the stakes grew higher. They both knew that if anyone found out, it would be the end of everything. Their families would never forgive them. The risk was monumental, but the connection they shared was undeniable. Clara felt herself drawn to Lucas in a way that defied reason. She had always been the strong, determined daughter of the Silva family, but in his presence, she felt something else, a softness, a vulnerability she hadn't known existed within her. Their secret meetings continued in the shadows, both of them dancing on the edge of something dangerous, something forbidden. Clara wasn't sure what would come of it, whether it would be just a fleeting moment, a passing attraction, or something more. But as she lay awake that night, her mind racing with thoughts of Lucas and the life she might have with him, she knew one thing for certain. She could no longer pretend that the hatred between their families was the only thing that defined her. The town had barely recovered from the festival when news of the tragedy spread like wildfire. Clara was standing in the garden, her hands buried in the earth as she tended to the flowers her mother had planted years ago, when the messenger arrived. The urgency in his steps, the breathlessness in his voice, were enough to send a chill down her spine. "It's your brother, Clara," he gasped, his face pale. "He's dead." For a moment, time stood still. Clara's heart skipped a beat, her world narrowing into a single, suffocating moment. Her brother, the light-hearted troublemaker, the one who had always been the joy of their household, he was gone. She felt the earth beneath her feet grow cold, the flowers in her hands wilting with the shock of the news. Her breath came in short gasps as the weight of reality crashed into her. The messenger, unable to meet her eyes, hesitated before continuing. "It was the Costas. There's no mistake. He was found outside their estate, beaten badly. It's clear they did this." Clara's mind raced as the words hit her like a blow. Her heart was torn between disbelief and rage, the grief mingling with a fury she hadn't known she possessed. Her brother had been killed, and her first instinct was to blame the Costas, just as her family had always taught her. Clara stood there, motionless for a long while, feeling the world around her shift. Her brother was gone, and with him, any remnants of peace that had once existed. She could already hear her father's voice in her head, rallying the family for revenge, and for the first time, Clara felt herself swept away in that tide of vengeance. The Costas had crossed a line that could never be undone. The news of her brother's death spread like wildfire, and soon, the Silva family was consumed by grief and rage. Clara's father, usually a man of reserved dignity, was unrecognizable in his fury. The house, once a sanctuary of family warmth, was now filled with the sounds of shouting, crying, and frantic planning. Clara couldn't escape the storm of emotions that swirled around her. She wanted to scream, to break something, to make the pain go away, but all she could do was stand at the center of it, watching as the world around her crumbled. Her father, shaking with anger, turned to her with a look that seemed to demand something from her, something that had always been expected. "We will not let this go unpunished, Clara," he declared, his voice thick with grief and venom. "The Costas will pay for what they've done. No one dishonors our family like this and gets away with it." His words were a rallying cry, and Clara felt the weight of his expectations press down on her. For a brief moment, Clara's mind flashed back to the time she had spent with Lucas, to the quiet conversations, to the way he had looked at her, with something other than hatred in his eyes. But now, that connection felt like a betrayal. How could she have let herself be swept away in something so dangerous, so reckless. Her loyalty to her family should have been unwavering, but as she stood there, surrounded by her father's anger and her family's grief, Clara realized that it wasn't just the Costas who had wronged them. She had made a choice to defy everything she had been taught, and now, that choice had cost her more than she could bear. The night grew darker as Clara wrestled with her emotions, torn between the love she had for her family and the guilt that threatened to consume her. The Costas had taken away the most important person in her life, and the bitterness in her heart began to grow. She could hear the voices of her family, her father's rallying cries for revenge, and for the first time in her life, Clara found herself agreeing with them. The fire of vengeance burned brightly, and she no longer knew where the line between justice and hatred began. As Clara sat in the quiet aftermath of the chaos, a decision began to form in her mind, one that would shape her future and forever alter the course of her relationship with Lucas. The grief, the anger, the sense of betrayal, it all melded into something sharp and cold, a thirst for revenge that overshadowed everything else. She no longer saw Lucas as the man who had once shown her kindness, as someone with the potential to be a part of her future. No, now he was just another Costa, a symbol of everything that had taken her brother from her, and of everything that had torn her family apart. That night, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the Silva estate, staring into the darkness. The weight of the past, the years of hatred and mistrust, hung heavily in the air. She could feel it in her bones. The need for retribution. Her family would never forgive her if she didn't stand with them. They would see her as weak, as disloyal, and she couldn't be that. Not now, not after all the sacrifices her family had made to keep their name intact. She had to choose the path of vengeance, the path that would restore her honor and avenge her brother's death. But as Clara stood there, something unexpected happened. The image of Lucas, his face gentle yet pained, flashed in her mind. She remembered the way he had opened up to her, the way he had spoken of his desire to break free from his family's history. Could it really be so simple? Could she really throw away everything they had shared for the sake of an ancient feud? The answer seemed obvious, but Clara couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something in her heart had already changed. In the days that followed, Clara threw herself into planning, determined to exact her revenge. But in her moments of quiet reflection, the conflict between love and hate gnawed at her. Her heart was torn, one side burning with the desire to protect her family, the other yearning for a love that, in this world of vengeance, could never be. And so, Clara stood on the precipice, the weight of her choices bearing down on her. What would she sacrifice to right the wrongs of the past? Clara's days became consumed by thoughts of retribution. The pain of her brother's death was still fresh, his absence haunting every corner of her mind. She could no longer hear his laughter echoing through the halls of their home, and the silence left in his wake was unbearable. The decision had been made. She had to act, and she would stop at nothing to make the Costas pay for what they had done. Every move she made, every word she spoke, was now in service of that singular purpose: vengeance. Her family, of course, was fully on board. They had waited for this moment for years, and Clara's transformation from grief-stricken sister to vengeful daughter had been swift and complete. Her father, always the strategist, wasted no time in organizing a plan. His eyes gleamed with the promise of justice, and Clara felt a chilling satisfaction in knowing that she was finally fulfilling her duty. She was no longer the girl who had questioned the reasons behind the feud. Now, she was the woman who would carry out the revenge her family had longed for. It felt like a weight was lifting off her shoulders, but it also felt like something darker was taking root inside her. Lucas's face haunted her thoughts, but she refused to acknowledge it. She could not afford to let him, or their brief connection, cloud her judgment. To her, he was no longer the man who had made her question everything she knew. He was the enemy, just like his family. She couldn't afford to think about the softer moments they shared, the vulnerable exchanges that had once made her believe there could be something beyond hatred. Those thoughts were nothing but distractions. She had a mission now, and she would carry it out with or without the memory of him. The days passed quickly as Clara and her family put their plan into motion. Every step was calculated, every action precise, but Clara's heart grew heavier with each passing day. The thrill of revenge, of making the Costas feel the pain that had been inflicted upon her family, was beginning to wear off. In its place was a coldness, an emptiness that spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Was this really what she wanted? Or had she, too, become a pawn in the game her family had played for generations? Clara's nights were the hardest, During the day, she could focus on the task at hand, the meticulous steps toward ensuring that the Costa family would feel the weight of their actions. But at night, in the quiet solitude of her room, the doubts crept in. She couldn't escape the memories of Lucas, his smile, the way he had listened to her when she spoke of her hopes and dreams, the way his eyes had shown a flicker of understanding that she had never seen in another person. But those memories, no matter how vivid, could not stop the rage that burned in her heart. The desire to avenge her brother had become a fire too fierce to ignore. The truth was, she had already lost him in more ways than one. The boy who had been her brother, the one she had shared her childhood with, was gone, taken away by someone from a family she had always despised. It felt like the only way forward was through the path of vengeance. Her father had made it clear that there was no turning back. The moment Clara had decided to take this route, she had sealed her fate. He was counting on her, as was the rest of the family. There was no room for hesitation, no space for weakness. Every move she made would be watched, and every action she took would have consequences. The weight of the task ahead began to press on her shoulders, but Clara couldn't stop herself. She was too deep now, too far gone to change course. Lucas's absence from her thoughts was growing more pronounced as she buried herself in the details of the plan. It was easier to focus on the mission than to acknowledge the ache inside her, a dull, persistent ache that whispered that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as sure of her path as she had once believed, but it was too late for second thoughts. The strategy was in motion, the pieces falling into place, and Clara was its driving force. She had her role to play, and she would see it through, no matter what. But as the days wore on and the family's preparation intensified, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing something she couldn't afford to lose. The day of the planned confrontation arrived with a tension that Clara could practically taste in the air. Her family was ready, her father was brimming with determination, and the others were set to execute their part of the plan. Clara, however, stood at the center of it all, her heart thundering in her chest, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had promised herself that she would not falter, that she would see this through no matter the cost. Yet, as the moment of action approached, a part of her wished for a way out, a door she could slip through to avoid the consequences of her choices. Her eyes, however, were clear, focused on the task ahead. This was the only way to restore her family's honor, to make the Costas feel the same loss she had felt. And yet, when she stood in front of the door, ready to take that first step toward revenge, the gravity of what she was about to do settled into her bones. This wasn't just about paying them back for her brother's death anymore. No, it had become something much darker. It had become about her own need to prove herself, to the Silvas, to herself, and perhaps even to the lingering image of Lucas in her mind. Clara took a deep breath, steeling herself against the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. The door creaked open, and she stepped into the world she had been avoiding for so long, the world where she was no longer just Clara, the daughter of the Silva family. She was something else now, something molded by grief and revenge. The family awaited her, their eyes filled with expectation, their every movement calculated and precise. And Clara was ready to take her place among them, no matter the cost. But as she looked around at the faces of her family, a haunting thought crossed her mind. Had she already lost herself? Was there a way back from this? Her hand tightened around the letter in her pocket, the final piece of their plan, and she pushed the thought away. There was no turning back now. The only thing left was to ensure that the Costas understood the consequences of crossing the Silvas. The aftermath of Clara's actions was far more devastating than she could have imagined. What had started as a single, desperate step toward revenge spiraled into something uncontrollable. The Silvas and Costas were at war, their feud now more intense than ever. Family members, once bound by their shared pain, now saw each other as enemies, each believing that the other had crossed a line that could never be undone. Clara, standing in the center of the chaos she had set in motion, felt the weight of her decisions press down on her with every passing moment. It was no longer just about avenging her brother's death. It had become about proving something to herself, to her family, and to Lucas. But Lucas was gone. His absence, like a shadow, loomed over Clara's every thought. Despite everything, despite the walls she had built around herself, she could not escape the memory of the time they had shared. She had chosen vengeance over love, and now, standing in the middle of the fallout, she realized that the price of her decision had been steeper than she could bear. The Silvas had lost their humanity in the pursuit of justice, and Clara had lost the one thing that had ever made her feel truly alive. Her heart, once so full of hope and possibility, was now a cold, desolate place. As Clara walked through the house, the silence felt suffocating. Her father was in his study, poring over documents that outlined their next move. The rest of the family moved like ghosts through the halls, their eyes hollow with the understanding that this war was far from over. And Clara, in the midst of it all, was beginning to feel the sharp sting of regret. She had hoped that this quest for revenge would heal the wound left by her brother's death, but instead, it had torn open a deeper rift, one that threatened to consume them all. But there was no turning back now. Clara had set the course, and the world around her was changing in ways she couldn't control. The Costas would pay for what they had done, but at what cost to her own soul? Clara didn't have the answers. All she had now was a path of destruction, one that stretched out before her, and a realization that her quest for vengeance had come at the expense of everything she had once believed in. Clara could feel the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her like a vice. The Silvas were relentless in their pursuit of retribution, every moment spent planning the next strike, the next calculated move. Her father's voice, once a steady force of reason, now rang with an edge of desperation. The family was unraveling, and Clara was at the center of it all. It wasn't just the Costas who were feeling the impact of her actions. Clara herself was being consumed by the flames of vengeance. The anger that had once fueled her now burned without purpose, leaving only ashes in its wake. What had she become? Late one night, as Clara wandered the estate, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The woman who stared back at her seemed unfamiliar, a stranger clothed in anger and regret. The fire that had once been a source of strength now left her feeling hollow, empty. She had convinced herself that revenge was the only way to heal the wound in her heart, but now she saw the truth. She had only deepened it. The loss of her brother had been the catalyst, but somewhere along the way, she had lost herself in the pursuit of justice. Was it worth it? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as Clara stood frozen in front of the glass, the weight of her choices pressing down on her chest. The silence in the house was deafening. Even in the chaos, Clara could feel the absence of the warmth she had once known. Her relationship with Lucas, once full of promise, had been sacrificed on the altar of family loyalty. She could no longer deny the depth of her feelings for him, the way his presence had changed her. But it was too late. He was gone, and she was left with the pieces of a broken family, a war that had no end in sight. As the days passed, the consequences of Clara's choices became clearer. The Silvas had won their small victories, but at what cost? The town was divided, families torn apart, and Clara felt herself drowning in the weight of the hatred she had helped to perpetuate. She had once believed that revenge would give her peace, but now all she felt was emptiness. The cycle of violence would never end, and Clara knew deep down that she had to choose: continue the war and watch everything she loved burn, or find a way to stop it before it was too late. Clara spent sleepless nights turning over her options, each one more heartbreaking than the last. The weight of her family's expectations, combined with the hollow pit of regret in her stomach, left her paralyzed. The conflict inside her was no longer just about right and wrong, but about her very identity. Was she the woman who sought vengeance at any cost, or could she be the person who ended this cycle of hatred? It was a question that gnawed at her every waking moment, and in the silence of the night, the answer seemed painfully clear. One evening, while walking alone through the town square, Clara saw a group of children playing, their laughter echoing in the cool air. Their innocence struck her like a blow to the chest. She remembered a time, not so long ago, when she had been just like them, unburdened by the weight of the past, with a heart full of dreams rather than grief. But that time felt like a distant memory now, something unreachable. She could feel the chains of her choices tightening around her, and for the first time, she understood the true cost of her quest for vengeance. It hadn't just destroyed the peace of her family, it had shattered her soul. As the town began to quiet down, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the Silva estate, looking out over the horizon. The moonlight bathed the world in a soft glow, and for a fleeting moment, Clara imagined a different future, one where she could let go of the past, where she could build something new with the pieces of what was left. But the reality of her situation was too harsh, too impossible to ignore. She had no choice but to face the consequences of her actions, even if it meant losing everything she had once held dear. Her thoughts drifted to Lucas, to the love they had shared, and to the forgiveness that had seemed so out of reach. Could she ever forgive herself? Could she ever find peace? The path to redemption was unclear, but Clara knew one thing for certain. If there was any chance of healing, it would only come if she was willing to step away from the cycle of revenge and choose a different path, one where love, not hatred, guided her steps.